Welcome to today's webinar using S&OP IBP to plan for post-COVID-19 new normal with our Victorian chapter. I'm Monique Vanek from Australasian Supply Chain Institute, and before we introduce our keynote for today, I'd like to run through some housekeeping for the webinar. Firstly, a technical check to ensure that everyone can hear me. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Fantastic. Thank you. If you're having any technical difficulties at all, please talk to us in the chat box, which is appearing on your screen now. We'll be running some polls throughout the webinar, which we will publish anonymous results. So please help us keep today as interactive as possible and respond to those polls. The Q&A section is not anonymous. Instead, it allows for you to post your questions to the panel and for other attendees to see. So please use this opportunity to share your thoughts. We'll be awarding 1 CPD point to attendees from today's webinar. Please note, however, that the process for redeeming CPD points is now self-service and only takes 2 steps. You visit the ASCI website, asci.org.au, and log in as a member. Find this event with the Events tab and click Register. This will secure your CPD point. The webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to the ASCI library for members tomorrow, and a closed LinkedIn group post will be created for further discussions after today's webinar. Before we get started, Ryan Lanson from our corporate partners at Michael Page would like to give us a brief market update. Over to you, please, Ryan.
Thanks, Monique. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here today, and also pay my respects to your elders, past, present and emerging. So yeah, thanks again, Monique, for putting together today, and to all the guest speakers. So many of you probably won't know me. You probably normally have more contact with Claire. She is far more interesting and far more entertaining than I am. So you're stuck with me today, unfortunately, but hopefully I'll just give you a quick market update with a few bits of data and some interesting stats, which kind of take us through a little bit of the year so far, pre-COVID and during COVID. So I'll give you that update really shortly. Firstly, on behalf of everyone at Michael Page, look, it's a really big sort of heartfelt regards, I guess, to everyone, particularly on the East Coast in Melbourne and New South Wales, who are obviously doing it pretty tough. There's no hiding behind what's happening over there at the moment. And from everyone at Michael Page, if there's anything that we at all can do to help out, if you've got friends or colleagues or anyone in your network that might need some help with CV advice or anything like that we can do to try and help in this current environment, then do feel free to reach out to your local Michael Page consultant, and we'd love to be able to try and help out in any small way that we can. So I'll give you some information on some data and some stats. So for any of the data enthusiasts out there, buckle up. This might be relatively interesting for you. For those who are less enthused, I won't be offended if you go and grab a cup of tea or a coffee or a tequila or whatever floats your boat at this time of the day. But yeah, I thought I'd put together some stats to give a bit of comparison year to date and just what's been happening in these last few months. So in June, it was actually a decent recovery when it came to job flow across the country. There are an additional 211,000 jobs in June, which was a massive turnaround from April and May. Those 2 months were horrendous, really, when it came to job flow nationally. Unemployment in June, again, it did nudge up ever so slightly from May, as did the participation rate, and hours worked also rose. So I think that's an indication that there were lots of companies that went down to part-time in April and May, and that's starting to get back to normal a little bit across the country now. South Australia and WA are the 2 states with the highest unemployment at the moment. So despite the fact that those 2 states realistically have the virus almost the best under control, it's not really reflected in the unemployment rate. And I'm over here in Perth, and again, it feels like even though the virus is under control, it's still very, very challenging from an economic point of view and an employment point of view, and that's really reflected in those stats there. So while it was a positive recovery month on month, Unemployment is still really high. Hours worked are still well below what they were at the start of the year. And most experts out there are still predicting a pretty significant decline in 2020. We're often asked to draw some comparisons between the employment market now versus in the GFC. And again, I think most experts will say this has probably got the potential to be significantly harder when it comes to the recovery during and post-COVID. So, yeah, look, it's definitely tough going out there. There's no question about it. And again, even over here in the Wild West, where things are pretty good when it comes to the health side of the pandemic, it's still really, really tough when it comes to employment. So we can't hide behind that. We'll just got a couple of little bits of information there around some of the skills that are in demand at the moment. And the skill demand is so heavily weighted towards technical, analytical, systems-based skill sets across inventory, supply chain analytics, lots of demand around change management. And that's people that can come in and, have a look at a change management program around people, systems, processes, all of those kind of things are the type of skills when there is recruitment going on. That's the sort of skill set that is in demand. Outside of the technical skill sets, the competencies are a really interesting one because in some cases at the moment, they're in more demand than the actual technical skills. And that's around candidates who can provide a strong skill set around supply relationship management, people who are able to show really strong adaptability and they can deal with the sort of market that we're in at the moment. And someone who can just deliver results, whatever the market is. We know it's a really tricky one, but someone who can still deliver results in that kind of market. The last thing I thought I'd share with you is some facts around the job flow from Michael Page specifically, kind of pre-COVID and what we would say kind of COVID onwards. So pre-COVID, I've identified as the 12 weeks prior, the first 12 weeks of this year through until around about the end of March. So we were recruiting around about 522 jobs per week on average across the Michael Page group in Australia. Now, in the 14 weeks from the start of April, you can see the dramatic drop there. It's well under half of the normal jobs that we would recruit week to week. So it's a really, really challenging time for everyone. And while the recovery just reared its head a little bit in May and June, I think with everything that's going on the East Coast at the moment, it's highly likely that the recovery that we're seeing will really stall. And my personal opinion is I think the market we're in right now, I think we need to get used to that. And I think this will be the market that we experience probably through until the end of the year when it comes to the amount of jobs, the recruitment activity, the employment trends. Just my opinion, but I think what we're experiencing right now will be what we see through until the end of the year. Again, if anyone would like any additional information, speak to your local Michael Page representative on the ground in the state that you're in, or to myself directly, and we'll always be happy to help out. So, Monique, I'll hand back over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for that update, Ryan. And to kickstart the webinar, may I introduce our host for today, Christine Miller, who has recently been appointed as Victorian Vice President for ASCI. Christine has held a chapter committee role for over a year now, and she's the head of supply chain advisory for CBRE, where she's responsible for establishing and growing a new business line within the industrial and logistics arena, delivering end-to-end supply chain services, aligning network and operational requirements with property and infrastructure. Christine is a senior executive leader with international experience in supply chain, driving business transformation and delivering results. She has developed and implemented solutions covering strategy, network design, organizational design, operating models, cost reductions, and transition management. We're really happy to have Christine on our chapter. Over to you now, Christine. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Monique. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I hope everyone's safe and well, and I do hope that you've had the opportunity for your supply chains to seize some opportunities in the current environment. While we're all gathered today, I'd like to just take the opportunity to let you know about some exciting new developments at ASCI. First, if you've been online recently, you might have noticed there's a new website based on the Wild Apricot member-based platform, and it allows you to have a new refreshing member portal. So log in using your existing user email address and change your password to access the portal. Right now, we're asking all members to log in and update their profiles. And given the current COVID-19 situation, your residential address would be preferred as the listed address. This will make sure that you actually receive your monthly MHD magazine. Also on the website, you'll notice an events section. And this is where you'll head after this webinar and register if you'd like to obtain a CPD point for your registration or certification maintenance. After the webinar, ASCI will be verifying all of our attendees and will allocate the points accordingly. ASCI is currently working on some new membership categories. This will line up with the professional accreditation scheme. So watch this space, and in the coming weeks, the webinar platform will be a crucial place for you to receive the most up-to-date information on these categories and how you can start your journey along the pathway to being a professional member. And lastly, it's my pleasure to make a new announcement on behalf of ASCI that due to the overwhelming response to S&OP and IBP during this unprecedented time, ASCI is launching a special interest group for ASCI members only. And this will be through the closed LinkedIn group. So this will bring together like-minded planning specialists once a quarter to network, share, learn, and discuss the current thinking and developments on integrated business planning. So both SAP and Oliver Wight will be thought leadership partners for content throughout the year. The group will be led by ASCI New South Wales Chapter Committee member Dave Woods, and topics will be driven from the group. So you can join. The inaugural meeting is going to be online, and that's Thursday, August the 20th. And the first topic is forecasting and the future. Now, what we've all been waiting for, it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar keynote presenter for today, Mike Reed. Mike is the managing partner of Oliver Wight Asia Pacific and is experienced in strategy management, product and portfolio management, and integrated business planning. He has 25 years hands-on experience working in industry and delivering change management projects with lasting results. Prior to joining Oliver Wight, Mike accumulated 25 years experience in industry. This included a variety of production, operations, and corporate roles with multinational firms, including Unilever, Mars, and Simplot. During the 13 years he was with leading food manufacturer Simplot, he guided the business through 3 major change initiatives, including the achievement of Oliver Wight Class A and the establishment of sales and operations planning within the Australia and US companies. Ultimately, Mike became the Chief Strategy Officer at Simplot Australia and established the strategic planning framework that's guided the company to where it is today. Mike has worked with a number of leading organizations, including BP Lubricants, General Mills, Revlon, Huntsman, One Steel, Case New Holland, and Kraft, assisting them on their journey to business excellence. Mike joins us today to explore the importance of an integrated process with scenario planning capability and some of the do's and don'ts moving forward. In the virtual world, raise your hand and help me welcome Mike. Over to you now, Mike.
Thanks very much, Christine, and hello everybody in this unauspicious day in Victoria, unfortunately. But anyway, I'm speaking to you from my lockdown place in Victoria, my home office here, where unfortunately I'm all set up so I don't have to go out and get in anybody's way. Anyway, welcome. This seminar is all about using our processes, S&OP, IBP, to plan for post-COVID new normal. So quite topical, really, isn't it, where we are. We're all looking forward to when that will actually happen. So in terms of a little bit about ourselves, quite a number of you would be familiar with us. We've been around for quite some time, 50 years now in the business. So we spend most of our time consulting with various clients around the place, but we've written a lot of the white papers on the subject, books on the subjects. We originated MRP2, MPS, DRP, S&OP, and the maturity journey. So we work with lots and lots of companies around the place. And I guess week at any point in time, we can say we are working with more than half of the top 100 Fortune 100 companies. So that's just a little bit about us. Today, I want to talk about two things essentially. Firstly, and this is sort of the first half of what we'll go through, is how are we running our S&OP IBP processes now? We've done a global survey, and I'm also going to be asking you guys some poll questions to see how things are going in your parts of the world, and then really starting to think about, well, what are the potential implications, of this, if what we've potentially done during this this COVID period, how's that impacting us, and what should we be thinking about as we move forward? In the second half, I really want to go through what we're calling becoming response ready. This whole COVID period has shown us there's a huge amount of uncertainty out in the world. Now, what I'd be suggesting is there's always been uncertainty. We're just seeing a significant amount of it at the moment. So the issue really is, how do we deal with that uncertainty? I'm sure we all want to guide our companies out of the current situation and into a better place as COVID goes away, ultimately. But there's going to be a great deal of uncertainty as we get there. What does the future really look like? So the subject really is, well, we need to think about scenarios. We need to think about being able to plan for alternative futures. So if we're going to be doing that, then what do we need to have in place in terms of our IBP and our shorter term, our ITP processes, integrated tactical planning, the weekly stuff? How does scenario planning align with those? Because we really ought to be using the processes we have in place anyway, lining up with those and making the most of them. So I want to start with a poll. So we'll open up the poll, and here we go. It's on the screen right now. So the poll is as follows. So starting off with, the question is, how well have your existing planning and execution processes enabled you to adapt to the changing circumstances we have been experienced through COVID-19? You have a choice, one of these five. It'll be not at all. We basically had to come up with whole new processes. It's about getting the senior team into the detail on the daily basis. Or you can go B, our short-term daily, weekly processes have needed to be adapted to respond effectively to volatility in demand and supply. So we've used our processes, but we've gone short-term and we've adapted them. C, somewhat. We've used our processes, but we have adapted them so that we can get senior team more into the detail and probably on a more short-term basis as well. The fourth point is that we've actually used them pretty well, but what we found we did is that we had to come back in a horizon. So whilst we might have had a 12, 18 or 24 month horizon, we may have shortened that a lot. So we'd call that, we've done it pretty well, but we've had to do something different. And finally, you might be in the very well category. So our processes in this state are very mature and we really didn't need to adapt. And we found they worked anyway. Even though people were working from home and we still needed to respond to change faster, the processes were working for us. So the poll's open, and here we have the results. So just looking at that, we see that this lines up actually fairly closely with what we found globally, by the way. Very few in the very well category, very few in the not at all category, but we do have a strong preponderance down. We've changed our short-term daily, weekly processes. We've perhaps gone into sort of daily crisis meetings or whatever, or we've gone, we've adapted our processes somewhat, but got into a lot more detail. That's very close to what we saw globally. So we'll just take that one off the screen now if we can, Monique, and we'll flip forward to the next page. I can get my page to work. Here it is. So this is what we found globally, as I say, lined up pretty closely with that result. So we asked the same question and we found, first of all, there's somewhat more that said very well. So in our survey here, we saw 15% that were very well, very small number of not at alls. And then there was that spread in between that. So 38% said well, which is slightly higher than ours, but we had a shortened horizon. So we came back in the time period we were looking at. 28% said somewhat, but we changed it so that the senior team were really more involved in the thing and a lot more detail and perhaps a lot more regularly. So we gone for faster cadences. And 15%, we adapted our short-term daily, weekly processes. So in other words, everything went into the short term. So thinking about that, what does that really mean for organizations? What we really distilled that down to, if we look globally, 85% of companies, and in our list here, it was closer to 90 because we had 5% at one end and 5% at the other. So 85 to 90% of companies actually changed their processes to manage during COVID-19. So thinking about the implications of that, firstly, there was a significant number of companies that we found were actually now adding daily crisis meetings. Now, my question would be, well, what were we doing before that? Did we never have a situation where supply and demand were out of balance? And what were we doing about that in those times? So, what on earth is going on here? We'd suggest that's actually part of a process we should have anyway. So adding daily crisis meetings looks like a bit of an issue. It looks like we didn't have a mechanism for managing supply and demand changes during the short-term execution period. We just found we now had to do it because there were so many changes and perhaps bigger changes. The second thing that we really got a bit concerned about was many businesses, and again we found that with our own poll today, temporarily suspending or changing significantly, shortening the horizon of their S&OP processes. Now, we would suggest that's actually a potentially fatal mistake. S&OP IBP processes are set up with a monthly cadence to get us planning beyond the lead time and out to our planning horizon, which is typically something like 24 months, so we can see things coming at us. So if we've shortened the horizon, how are we planning for the future is our question. If we've done that, we actually need to restart things. We stand a very real possibility of not being able to emerge from this crisis because we're not planning out beyond it. So that's a big watch out. So thinking about this, these cogs all work together. So our integration processes are actually more important today than they ever were. We're trying to tie things together. If we separate these cogs, the thing isn't working. So what we'd suggest is that the process is likely to be single-minded. That's different, right, to not operating as it should do. It might be fairly single-minded, but it should be looking out beyond the next 4 months. And we do need to work it hard because we need to do lots of what ifs. What if this scenario occurs? What if that scenario occurs? What will be our contingency plans? The second thing we need to do is that shorter term process, what we call integrated tactical planning, the weekly cadence that needs to be going on, that needs to be harnessed. That needs to manage those daily changes. It should actually be the central command center for picking up changes and replanning early and effectively. Now, if we're using that well, it'll actually become part of our triggers for scenario plans as well. A little bit more about that later. So the key thing here is that the issue is different. It's not the way the change is managed, it's what issues it is dealing with. So watch out for that. We can get into a situation where we're all relying on intuition and past experience rather than looking at what we need to plan for and doing that. So dealing with the facts as they arise is really, really important. And looking for multiple futures. We are in a situation where there are likely alternative futures, right? So we have to plan for those. So this is the whole thing about scenario planning. And we still have to do daily, perhaps even hourly replanning. Check and adjust daily and hourly is important. So watch out for getting into crisis stuff that actually takes our eye off where we should be going and what might be telling us if we need to switch from plan A to plan B to plan C. Those are the important things, having those set up in front. So integration still matters. Let's do another poll. So this poll is all about how often are we formally reviewing our business assumptions in the current environment. So again, you've got a choice of 5. So your assumptions, are you doing that on a quarterly basis or on a once a month basis, on a weekly basis, daily, or you're not even doing it? Which of those fits your organization? How often are you formally, emphasis on this, formally reviewing your business assumptions? So think about this. IBP, S&OP are assumptions-based planning processes. So therefore, we should be reviewing our assumptions. So what are we doing? So what answers are we getting here out of this? Are we ready to go with answers just yet, Monique? Here we go. So, ooh, this is positive. So formal review of assumptions on a monthly basis looks to be pretty good, okay? Some are doing it weekly. There can be a bit of a watch out there. So we would suggest that we need to review and understand whether our assumptions are coming off on a weekly basis. Drifting out to quarterly, I would suggest, is a real problem here. So our assumptions are likely to change more often. So we need to understand them. We need to see what's going on out in the marketplace, but we need to compare it to the plans we have. And really, we need to have alternative plans in place if our assumptions are changing. Otherwise, we're replanning on the run. So again, reinforcing this concept, we need to have scenario planning and contingency planning in place if we're going to be able to respond to this. Okay, so what we'd suggest is this: agreeing assumptions is actually more important than ever. So don't rely on experience and intuition. There is uncertainty out there, but that uncertainty is a bit like gambling. So believe it or not, there actually are 5 rules to gambling. Some people will say, well, there's only one rule, don't gamble. But we'd suggest that, if we're dealing with uncertainty, there is a certain amount of risk in gambling going on. So think about it this way. 1, if the uncertainty is high, don't invest too much. Okay, so think about that. A great deal of uncertainty should mean we are not putting all our eggs in one basket. So don't invest much. Bringing the uncertainty down, though, enables us to invest more. So watch for circumstances that allow us to bring the uncertainty down. So as a consequence of that one, think about, well, should we be doing something to bring the uncertainty down? Should we be investing in that, such as, buying syndicated reports, spending more time in desk research, checking past epidemics, talking to other companies, speaking to a CEO of a Thai-based company, well, he's a Thai CEO of a global-based company, actually. And his comment was that, they're actually spending more time talking to each other as CEOs around the various parts of their organization in the various countries. And it's amazing what they're learning. So we should be doing that sort of thing. Think about making your decision-making iterative. So do continue to run IBP and the supporting ITP process so that you can update decisions in an integrated fashion and a considered fashion. And finally, if you think about a rule for gambling, always have a backup plan. So I'd call that, have a plan A, a plan B, possibly even a plan C. That's the contingencies we're going to need to have. So think about, learning from history, learning from what else is going on around the place, and do know what your assumptions are. So what are the assumptions you need in your organization to agree today? How long is something happening? How deep will the impact be? Will there be channel switching? If so, how much? So if we're thinking about retail versus food service, for example, in the FMCG food game, we know there's channel switching going on. Food service isn't doing much, retail is. So we're seeing companies that are doing much better in their retail side of their business, but not very much in food service. So is that happening in your company? What's going on as a consequence of this this pandemic, and what should you be assuming will be happening in the future? Think about, well, is consumer behavior and preferences changing? So if you're working in an organization that's got quite a lot of online ordering going on, on website ordering, etc., well, I'll bet you're seeing a hell of a lot more of that today than you were previously, because people are stuck at home. And what are our trade-offs? What are we prepared to trade off? Availability versus cost. So all of those assumptions are critically important to us as we work through this thing. So that really brings us to the second part. So far I've talked about, well, how important is it that we've got a solid S&OP IBP process, and we've got that supported by a robust weekly, daily process that manages us into execution, and how should we be using assumptions? So that really raised that question. Well, assumptions nowadays are uncertain. So how do we manage an uncertainty? So let's start with another poll question. So this is a yes, no. Has your business developed scenarios and contingency plans to respond to issues and opportunities for different potential post-COVID-19 environments? You only get to choose yes or no, as far as this one's concerned. So where are we at here? The poll's up on the screen. A couple of minutes to think about that. So scenarios and contingency plans. And we're asking, you have to have both of those to get a yes. Scenarios plus contingency plans. So you've got a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, etc. Okay, so there we go. A little over half have, a little under half have not. That's actually quite significantly different to what we saw globally, although I don't know when people answered this question globally, whether they answered the bit about contingency plans, because I was pretty specific about that. I said, well, we have to have contingency plans. So in terms of the global survey results, what we saw was that just a little over 2/3, 71% had said yes, a bit under 1/3 said no. So we were a bit over a half, a bit under a half. So slightly different to the global survey that we saw, but nonetheless, really, really interesting. So let's think about this thing, this uncertainty. Well, firstly, I'd put it to you that there is no such thing as certainty anyway. A gentleman named Voltaire came up with this concept. Certainty is an uncomfortable position. Sorry, uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one. Who can predict the future? Right? Well, we can't. So we can't actually be certain about anything. So, think about the little gentleman standing in front of these two doors. There's question marks over both of them. Nothing is actually certain. So we need to think about the fact that if things are not certain, then what are we going to do when we're living with uncertainty? The only thing that really changes from my point of view here is that sometimes things are more uncertain than others. So when things are more uncertain than others, we must be able to deal with that. So think about that. Already opened up the idea that this is about scenario planning and contingency planning. So here's a definition for you, straight out of the Apex Dictionary. So think about what we've got going on here. Scenario planning looks ahead and says, what are our potential different futures, okay, that we could say are likely to happen, okay? So this is really important of seeing if there are multiple alternative futures, then we really have to consider which of those should we plan for and how. So that says that we need to be thinking about this concept of contingency planning. So contingency planning is really quite simple. It is about setting up responses in the event that a particular scenario occurs. So we would call that being response ready. So if we only have one plan, and there are multiple alternative futures because things are quite uncertain, we haven't got anything to fall back on at all. So scenario planning and contingency planning becomes really, really important as uncertainty increases. Scenarios are actually about answering that what if. What if this happens versus what if that happens? It allows us to have options. It allows us to think about the future and what the consequences or effects of that future are. So Michael Porter had a good quote on this. It's an internally consistent view of what the future might turn out to be. It's not a forecast, but one possible future. So if we're in the mode that S&OP is about forecasting, please get out of that mode. We are about understanding what the future is likely to be. And if there are multiple alternative futures, then we have to deal with that as well in our S&OP IBP process. So it's about setting ourselves up for more than one possible future. It is about providing those decision options and impacts, right? So that we can establish what if scenarios. We can understand vulnerabilities and opportunities. Really important thing here is how are we going to make the decision around these? Where are these plans going to be considered? How will we determine which ones we'll put in place and which ones don't make sense? We also need to be able to model, right? We need planning, optimization, and scheduling systems that are probably a little bit above what we've got today. This is about being able to optimize and re-optimize the organization, about having alternatives to choose from. So a key issue here is how fast can we develop simulations and models, right? If we're not able to do that particularly quickly, that can actually be rate limiting. It means we can't feed our process. It means that really all we've got is potentially one alternative, one future, and really no alternatives that we can consider and we can bring to bear as contingency plans. So think about that as well. And we asked the question a bit later, what do we do? What sort of tools do we have to support these things? Think about scenario planning as a process. So a piece of the puzzle here is that we've got to identify what's changing, what we believe will happen in the future or could happen, and alternatives around that. What are our options? What inputs do we need to understand in order to develop those scenarios? And then we have to analyze, model, conduct simulations of these things so that we can feed through our process with information-based decisions and then take actions. And we have to close the loop on that, because we have to now say, well, is anything telling us these are no longer correct, right? That we should be adopting a different plan, and do we have that plan ready to go? We think about being response ready as being an equation, if you like, with 6 critical elements. So let's just look at those. The elements really are these. If you look at, first of all, what's the nature of the future? So those are the scenarios that we want to prepare contingency plans for. So the pieces of the puzzle there are, firstly, what are these situations that have the highest possible impact? In other words, if a particular view of the future impacts us in a major way, then we have to have a scenario around that if it has a degree of uncertainty associated with it. So notice that I'm using the term situations which have uncertainty. So if a future is reasonably certain, right, if we can pretty much say, oh, well, that's more than likely to happen, this particular future, it hasn't got a high degree of uncertainty. So it really has much less impact upon us, right, in terms of considering planning. So if we see a future that has a high degree of uncertainty, where that has a big impact on us, what we want to be looking for now is what are the extremes that we should be planning for. So think about this with regard to the COVID situation. The question is, when are we going to emerge from COVID? So there is a great deal of uncertainty about that. So that sounds like a candidate for a scenario. The extremes that we might be thinking about, well, late next year, that's possible. If we don't get a vaccine until the middle of next year, then we have an ongoing situation that is still a COVID situation. So we have to make assumptions around that. If we get a vaccine by Christmas, that's a whole different scenario. So those are 2 extremes that we want to be thinking of. There's a high impact, there's a great deal of uncertainty, and we can paint some extremes around it. So we can develop scenarios around that. So think about uncertainty, impact, and extremes as being the situations that we want to develop scenarios around. Then we go into the planning piece. So we want to plan for those alternative views of the future. And we want to know what are the triggers that would move us from plan A to plan B. And we want to be practiced in that as well. So we do not want to be in a situation where we've prepared a plan B, but we haven't actually thought about how we'd enact that plan B, and we haven't practiced anything about detecting the triggers, etc. So think about, there's the equation. We have to identify what do we need scenarios around? Well, that's based around the degree of uncertainty, the impact on us, and the extremes that we can see. And then we need to have plans, and which are contingency plans surrounded by triggers, and we need to ensure that the organisation can actually enact them. If we've got all those 6 things in place, then we will be response ready. So being response ready does mean asking key questions. Where are those biggest areas of uncertainty? What are the potential scenarios or extremes that should we be dealing with? And what do we need to do? So we've moved into that planning phase now to mitigate or leverage. when do we need to act, and what will tell us that we need to act. So those are the triggers. So think about those as really the 5 questions that sit behind those 6 pieces of that puzzle. Those first 2 pieces of the puzzle are the uncertainty, scenario, and extremes piece, and then we get down to the planning stuff. In order to make this work well, we need to link it to our processes. So think about a monthly cadence, IBP, five steps in this. So standard IBP S&OP process must link to a weekly execution and control process. We call that integrated tactical planning. So the IBP process gives us long-term direction setting. So that's where our plans come from. Thinking about our weekly process, this is where we're likely to see the signals of whether we need to change or not. So changing in facts, changing in the triggers can be detected through demand sensing, demand control, supply performance. How are things going on our supply side? How are our suppliers going? How is our distribution going? We're going to pick those signals up on a weekly basis through our IBP process. Now, sorry, I just went ahead and I didn't want it to. Through our IBP process, now we are going to be doing the contingency plans here and adjusting them based on feedback that we've got via our quorum of IBP process leaders. We'll be detecting as we go through each of the pieces of the IBP process on a monthly basis, the product review, the demand review, supply review. We'll be building the picture and inputting into our integrated reconciliation process, understanding whether our scenarios need to be refined, understanding whether we need to pull triggers. Through our weekly process now, we can see those signals actually occurring. If they are occurring, we're monitoring for them because we understand them. If we need to pull a trigger in the short term, we can do it because we've built the plans in the first place via our S&OP or IBP process. And through our weekly process, we have a well-defined escalation mechanism if we need to reconnect back to our senior team. So this isn't about dragging our senior team into daily crisis meetings. This is about having a weekly, daily process that allows us to see what's going on through appropriate information gathering, the ability to escalate based on certain conditions, certain authority boundaries, etc., having plans in place in the first place that we can pull the trigger on quite quickly. So a final poll before we finish up. So thinking about tools, and I suggested that's pretty important. So the question is, what tools does your business use to run and analyze scenario simulations? Your choices are, we don't have any tools. We use Excel spreadsheets. We use homegrown ERP solutions. We have established ERP systems and we use those, or we have dedicated software solutions and we use that. So I'll give you a little bit of time just to do the poll. All right, the answers, okay. Again, remarkably similar to our global survey here. We found that significant number of people are using Excel spreadsheets. So the issue around that, of course, if we're using Excel spreadsheets, modeling and simulations can take quite a while. Being integrated with the data is actually rather important. So if we're able to do it in established ERP systems, if they have that capability already, that's fantastic. If we've got dedicated software solutions that can rapidly extract data out of our systems, and that's even better. Excel spreadsheets, whilst they do have a place for modeling, if we want to do a lot of them, they actually become quite rate limiting. So let's have a look at how this worked globally and what our answers were. So on a global basis, we found that the majority were actually using established ERP systems, with a significant minority using Excel spreadsheets, with hardly anybody at the dedicated software solutions and not a lot of people at no tool area either. Key thing here is that and it's captured in that headline there, tools are essential. So not having adequate tools can actually be rate limiting. So bear in mind what I said earlier, we may want to have plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. How are we going to come up with those to run and analyze those if we don't have adequate tools to do them? So takeaways. What does all this mean? Firstly, our recommendation is don't throw out your S&OP or IBP process. Make it work for you. So make sure that you actually have the fundamentals in place. Now, it sounds a bit like Business Management 101, doesn't it? But do remember, if the foundations are weak, then whatever you're using to build is also weak. So ensure that your agendas are tight, that you have got your meetings in place with the right people still there, and they're not diverted off into something else. Very tempting if we've got crisis happening all over the place for people not to even be attending these meetings. So we need to look out for that and say, well, what have we got to do to overcome that? So watch out, tight agendas and meetings. Do review your assumptions, really understand what's underpinning this thing. What are you building scenario plans on? You'll need to ensure that your horizon is out far enough. So watch out for that. If we've shortened the horizon, we potentially aren't seeing those things coming at us. So ensure that we've got the right horizon there. Think about scenarios and simulations. Look for what are the decision points and what are the decision-making points here and who will make them. Think about the team that's in here. Roles and responsibilities are really important. So remember, it's the issue that's changed, not how it's managed. And secondly, do make scenario planning a core competency. So look at what is your process? Do we have clear roles and responsibilities when we're putting together scenarios? How does that work and how does that connect to the business planning and execution processes that we have in place anyway? Again, ensure we've got simulation and modeling capability with tools. Do develop regular alternative views of the future and make sure we have plans in place, and do connect that scenario planning process with IBP and ITP. And just a few words to finish. Watch out, if we're spending all of our time treating the symptoms of the fever, we won't develop the vaccine that we need. So that's kind of relevant in a COVID time, isn't it? So we want to recover from this fever, not just the COVID bit, but what's happening in our world at the moment, driven by COVID. So what are we doing now to create the recovery that will happen once COVID is actually over? I'm assuming that COVID will be over one day. I don't think the world is going to tolerate it too much. It's a question of how long. So that's really what I wanted to discuss today. I'm going to move over now to a bit of a Q&A. So I'm going to turn back to, whoops, I'm sorry about that. Turn back to Christine and Monique to help drive the Q&A. What have we got there?
Mike, thank you. That was fantastic. And there was just so much in there. So we are going to move to Q&A, but I'm going to give Mike just a quick chance to catch his breath after sharing all of that with us. I did want to take the opportunity to mention that as a valued ASCI corporate member, Oliver Wight is extending a 10% discount to the ASCI members for the online courses. So if you hop onto the new website into the events section, you'll find that there are 3 courses there offered under the program: IBP for supply chain, integrated tactical planning, and managing demand. So I'd invite you all just to hop on there and take advantage of that. Mike, if you're ready, we've got quite a few challenging questions coming through. Maybe we'll start with one that's a bit of a clarification. We've got a question in regards to, is IBP/SOP a process or a system? And how does supply chain define system versus process?
Okay, interesting question. I don't think I've had that one before, though, so let me give this a go. I guess we would define IBP or S&OP as a process, but it's a process supported by the appropriate people and behaviour stuff, the appropriate measurement systems, KPIs, etc. But we'd still say, well, it is a process. It has to be defined as a process, but people need to understand how to use it, and it does also need appropriate tools. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not quite sure of the background behind that, so I'm not sure if I've answered it to the extent that it was asked. But anyway, hopefully that's the answer.
I think that's a good one. Mike, can I just invite you to turn your camera on so everyone can see your
I can certainly
smiling face?
All right, let me do that.
That way it gives someone more than just me to look at. There we go. Fantastic.
Oh, you can see me. All right,
yes,
look at that.
Now everyone can see your smiling face. So, Ashwin has come in and asked, now if COVID remains and is going to be normal, how do we plan?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. What I'd suggest there, if COVID remains and is going to be a normal, that's actually one of the scenarios. But if it does end up remaining, then we just simply need to plan for it as it is. If COVID is the new normal, then what are our assumptions around that? Do we assume that we're going to get much more online purchase, for example? Do we assume that industries which have to have a lot of participation, physical participation in them, are going to be dampened off? I would say yes. If we're going to be dealing with COVID into the future, people aren't going to be working very closely together. So again, it's a case of what are our assumptions behind this? What drives demand and supply, for that matter, in our organisation, and consequently, how will we plan for that based on those assumptions if COVID is the new normal? Okay, so thinking about that as it applies to your organisation, then that's how we would do it.
Exactly. Olena sent in and was specifically asking about suppliers, so I'm glad you touched on that. Now, Nigel's wondering if you have any suggestions for communicating the different scenarios up into the management business review. Good question.
Okay, that's great, because this really does then connect our scenario planning process to IBP. And I would say that the majority of time in any MBR at the moment should be spent on understanding potential scenarios and our contingency plans. So when we first develop the scenarios, we need to put those scenarios plus their contingency plans into the management review for consideration anyway, and sign off on them. And in particular, signing off that we have actually modeled this thing correctly and these are potential views of the future, and that the plans make sense, plan A, plan B, plan C, whatever it is, and that we have got the triggers identified and we know how we are going to monitor them. And that's probably the most important thing, because if we see a change, which is a trigger to go from plan A to plan B, we need to be able to do that pretty quickly. We don't want to wait another month for the next MBR to say, well, now switch from plan A to plan B. So that's how I would suggest do it, is make sure those elements of the scenario plans and contingency plans are very clear to the management team, so they know what they're signing off on.
Okay, good advice. Gary's wondering, how do you see the link between strategic network optimization and IBP evolving?
Okay, so to us, the relevant element here is the supply review as part of our monthly integrated business planning process. And we actually set a bar pretty high for a supply review. A supply review is not just about understanding how we are going to balance demand with supply and what it might cost us to do something different. It has that as its foundation, if you like. If it's not doing that, then it's not meeting its purpose at all. But we would suggest that there's a much higher bar here. Really, what the supply review is about, it's about the purpose of the supply chain part of the organisation anyway. And that's to provide a competitive advantage for the organisation through agility and lean, right? That's what we're trying to do. Right, as a supply team, if you like, and we need to monitor that through our supply review process. So the question about strategic network optimization, well, we should be considering how we are going to optimize our network. How are we going to be able to respond faster? How are we going to improve the velocity of our supply chain? What plans do we have in place to do that? And how are we monitoring to ensure that those plans are actually coming off and our supply chain is becoming more agile and responsive, because that's our task. So the supply review should see that. The supply review doesn't set the strategy, but it sure as heck needs to see it getting deployed.
Somewhat related to that, MTS has asked, what's the best way to test, simulate, and use real-world applications to use IBP and S&OP?
okay, I'm not quite sure what's sitting behind this, MD. So I'll try and interpret it as best I can. Test, simulate, and use real-world applications to use. Sorry, Christine, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I think probably I would interpret that as understanding if we've got tangible impacts that we know, say, are coming from COVID-19, how do you actually put that into the planning process?
Oh, absolutely. So again, this is about what are our assumptions. Bear in mind that IBP, S&OP are assumptions-based planning processes. Okay, it is not forecasting, right? This is trying to plan our future. So if we see, that there is some alternative view of the future, or even just assumptions about the future, then they must enter our planning process. So if it's about how do we see demand being shaped over the next 12 to 24 months, those are the assumptions that are shaping demand. And we put that through and again, if we need scenarios around that, we inject it at that point through our demand review process, and we bring it through to our reconciliation process. If our scenarios are about how will we be dealing with our suppliers in this rather awkward world that we have today when things don't work quite as well and things aren't moving around the way they traditionally do, then we've got scenarios in there as well. So what we're doing now is we're using our process to capture this information and drive scenario planning.
Now, Edwin's got a good question. I'm curious to see what you think about this one. Is it possible to implement S&OP and IBP in a decentralized purchasing model?
Oh, I need a bit of definition. Somebody help me. A decentralized purchasing model. What do you understand by that?
I think he's probably envisioning multiple sites having authority to actually bring product or sourcing into the flow, would be my guess.
All right, yeah. So everybody can make up their own mind, kind of thing. Well, I guess that comes down to how the company sees decision authorities. So it is absolutely possible to implement, but we have to have the decision-making authorities clear. If we're all able to simply do our own thing, we've potentially got something that's sub-optimized in the first place. So I kind of question that. But let's suppose we've set it up well with the right decision-making authorities in there, then I would say, well, you just simply structure your IBP process to recognize those agreed decision authorities.
Now, Venkat has come in with a question that I'm sure is on quite a few people's minds, is how do we realistically incorporate into IBP the COVID-19 situation since the historical figures don't reflect the impact?
But we can still learn from history. It is not true that we have not had anything like this in the past. We certainly have. We had a global pandemic in 1919. We had a global financial crisis, not that long ago. We did have SARS, right? Well, we didn't have that much in this part of the world, but we did have it. It hit Asia pretty badly. So we can learn from history. What happened? What impact did it have at the time? So think about similar events, not just pandemics. Right? We only get global pandemics, it would seem, about once every 100 years. I hope we don't get another one in my lifetime, that's for sure. But we do get significant global changes, reasonably often. Think 9/11, think global financial crisis. They all changed the world in some form or fashion. We had to deal with all of them. So those things can happen, and we should be using those to help guide, well, what do we do when this big thing goes on? What can we learn from the past?
Good point. Guys, we've got quite a few additional questions coming through, so keep popping those through. We are coming right up until 2 o'clock, and I know we've got to keep it close on time. So I'll probably cut off the questions at that point right now. However, Monique is taking a record of all of them, so we will get questions. All the questions that have been sent in have been answered, but we've just come up to the end of our time today. So I'd like to just quickly thank our partners, Michael Page, and especially Mike and Oliver Wight, for your time and your insight today. Please don't forget, everyone, that if you'd like to continue the discussion after today's webinar, there will be a post in the closed LinkedIn group, and you can comment, share, because there's definitely some great discussions going on around these questions. So I think it'd be fantastic if we could continue that discussion there. If you haven't already done so, please drop a note with the letters CPD into the Q&A box before you sign off, just to make sure that you can receive the points there. Now, as you would see on the screen, is we've got our next webinar. So coming up next week as part of the leadership series, collaborating across silos and cross-functional teams remotely. And for those of us who are definitely working remotely for the foreseeable future, that's definitely a very timely topic. So hoping everyone can join for next Wednesday. In that webinar series specifically, they'll look at the remote project management and collaborating across silos. The panel will specifically address the main challenges of managing a remote team, challenges of remote project work, and techniques for maintaining productivity and progress, and specifically look at 2 customer projects and how they were managed during the COVID-19 environment. The webinar is going to be moderated by ASCI Queensland President James Scotland and co-hosted by Michael Page, Brisbane. So thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again.